All right, I think we're live on YouTube now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, panelists, thank you so much for your patience. And we're going to, you can also feel free to just process that moment that we have. I don't like to pretend that something didn't happen. Thank you so much for your patience. We're going to, I have to mute myself on YouTube. You can also feel free to just process that moment that we have. I don't like to pretend. Okay, great. So as we are, I don't want to pretend that nothing happened. I want us to be aware of the world that we're living in, and really be in a space where we can have emotional safety here. So I'm going to jump to the second question, but also kind of take it a little bit in our own direction. So first, I want to just start with, I believe Jeff is still here. Is that right?
Yep.
Cool. Good to see you. Okay, gotcha. Got to go to my speaker view here. All right, Jeff. And so I'm going to start with first just Jeff, and also with Jason. Jeff and Jason. This question is really mainly for you to jump us off, and then the other two, you guys, Mahalil and William, can jump in as you so desire. But essentially, as you are talking to a lot of people who are asking your opinion now, Jeff, I saw on your Instagram, you were speaking in front of the city hall, and you were giving, admonition to people about educating themselves on allies of racial matters, of systemic injustice, and also just how do you actually, really move the needle for the conversation for Black and Brown people to reverse the history of 400 years of oppression in this country. And I know that, Jason, you speak out a lot in general on these issues, being a social worker and someone who's advocating for change. So I just would love to hear, what resources are you recommending to people, and what kinds of advice are you giving in terms of how do we as a community come together to be strong? And even just as we experience a Zoom bomb together, say, hey, look, I know that you're experiencing this in your own silo and I'm experiencing this in my silo, but we're all experiencing somewhat a version of the same thing, and we can come together using these mental health resources or these even personal economic resources to be able to move the needle. So maybe Jeff first and then Jason.
Sure. And wow, thank you again, Sean, for just bringing us back on, right? And, and not saying we're going to shut everything down. I think that this conversation, as we all just saw, 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, was really needed. And society doesn't like when we all come together, right? So, so thank you so much for that. So, just in terms of, I guess, what I'm doing, or just the talking points that I have, so I was just, at Borough Hall, and then yesterday I was on Yahoo Finance talking about economics, right? So, two things that I always say is that social justice without economic justice is like one hand clapping, right? So you need both. So, when I was on Yahoo yesterday, they asked, what exactly can corporations do? And it's really these three things, right? So it's purchasing. Where do corporations purchase from, right? So it's important that they use Black and Brown owned businesses, companies, so that they could purchase from, right? So what is the supply chain looking like? And then it's hiring, right? So, who are they hiring, and what level and what reach do they have? So corporations have a lot of chief diversity officers, which is good, but what role does the chief of diversity officer has? Is there a budget behind he or she's position? Do they have staffing? What is the capacity that they have? And also, who do they report to, right? Because if you just say that you have a chief diversity officer, but they don't necessarily have the pull or the reach or the ear of the CEO or the president or whomever, then you have a figurehead that doesn't necessarily have a lot of reach, right? And then lastly, it's depositing, right? So we need to deposit into Black-owned banks, Black-owned institutions, and also Black-owned venture capital firms, because what that does is it helps to reinvest back into the community. So it's really a holistic approach And it starts with, with us, obviously, because we need to make sure that we're well organized. But in terms of what corporations can do, that's really what I've been speaking about for the past week, in terms of what can corporations do, because you hear now so much dollars, billions of dollars are being pledged. So Bank of America pledged $1 billion. SoftBank pledged $100 million, in Facebook $100 million and all of that stuff. That's cool, but we need also tangible action items that they can do on their end to push our community forward.
Awesome, Jeff. Really powerful stuff. I want to hear from Jason before I respond as well.
First, I just want to say, echo Jeff's sentiments and shout you out, Sean and Jorge, for having us come back on despite what just happened, and your leadership, right? Like still holding your composure and professionalism and being able to move forward. And I definitely commend you both for doing that and having us back here. So with all of that said, I love Jeff what you're saying about just that economic piece there and how important that is and the accountability of leadership. In addition to that, I think if I'm thinking about resources, I think about a lot of what I just started out with, right? And talking about what it means to unpack our identities, which is to me a form of healing, right? Unpacking that trauma and a lot of those things, but being able to have those conversations with young people and encourage them to ask questions about what's happening and listening to them and saying like, what do you need from us? Like, what are you concerned about? What does this look like? And creating these spaces for them to share out and have conversation, and just us being transparent with people, not just our young people, but with everyone, right? A lot of people have a lot of questions about what's happening. And I don't think it's up to us to have to educate everybody on all these inequities, but I do think in general, we all do have to, do our part in educating and encouraging folks to read particular books, right? Just in the past few years, Bettina loves We Want to Do More Than Survive. I'm a big fan of that. I'm an adjunct professor. I teach that to my high school students and my graduate students as well. I think that's a really popular book that students love. I think, Chris Emden has put out some work recently, right? And I think starting with also reading some of these things and trying to understand and learn about, what is happening, because this is hundreds and hundreds of years in the making. And it's perfect racism that this country has created, and not just here, but in other countries, right? So I think educating ourselves, but also our young people and those around us with what's happening, and being intentional about it, right? Like, what does it mean to allow students to learn about historical figures that look like them and identify as them, and what does that mean for them? So I think really doing that and encouraging them to do the research on, themselves, to learn about what's happening, but giving them the tools to be able to go out and do that research, which I think also ties to what Jeff was saying, right? Understanding what policies exist, understanding who's in leadership roles. I think a lot of the things he mentioned, we can apply to education and nonprofit spaces. If you're a nonprofit, who sits on your board? What does budgets look like? A lot of this information is public. And I think really, really trying to do our part in understanding and raising awareness, but then translating that to the young people that come after us so that they can be well informed and be able to take the baton and continue moving forward.
Awesome. That's so powerful. It's interesting to me, Jason, because you're talking about the next generation. And I feel like, in a lot of ways, you are the now and the next generation, because there's so much that needs to be done and education needs to happen for us to stay connected and really move the needle. But these conversations really, for me, are always bringing a sense of like support. I'm not in it by myself. And so this question specifically for Dr. Bethia and for William, a lot of your work really is geared towards making sure that young men feel like they're not by themselves. A lot of times I have been a product of educational environments where I was the only one, or I was one of a few Black males. And then when I was in my college environment, people thought I was there on a basketball scholarship, all sorts of things. And I didn't even see an example of a Black male teacher in my classroom outside of like a teacher I had in 6th grade. So I know that many of you are doing great work of, especially by Dr. Bethia, William, Jason, of really trying to make sure that now we start to see examples of what we want to be. So in terms of your work and how that matters, what would you say are the next important steps in education for us to take to make sure that we are providing equitable outcomes or opportunities and access for men and boys of color? Dr. Bethia and then William.
Yeah, so there's a lot to that question. But there are kind of two specific lanes that I'm thinking about. And one is a lane that a lot of folks are not discussing, which is assessment and curriculum, right? We talk about curriculum a lot. We say, hey, we need to make sure that there's, culturally responsive curriculum that's available to classes. But I'll give an example. There are 38 AP exams, not one of them, right, is an AP exam that focuses on the African diaspora, that focuses on so what are we communicating to kids, right? And then even if you put as a Black history teacher, so for those who don't know, I started my career as a 10th grade world history teacher, right? Knowing there's a dual consciousness that teachers have to fight, right, with themselves, an internal conflict between what I know I want kids to understand about themselves, but also their success in graduating and getting the credits that they need to move forward. And that should not have to be a struggle, right? And so I think part of the work is about saying, how are we setting up teachers, right? Because there's a lot of people having conversations about, well, what's the teacher doing or not doing? But how are we setting up those teachers for success? And ultimately, if I know that the world history exam is going to be 90% European history, then that's what I got to teach, even if I know that's not right. Even if I know that doesn't feel good, even if I know that I'm looking at my room and the entire space is Black and brown children, I know that in order for them to get out of my class, they're gonna have, the French Revolution takes priority over the Haitian Revolution, right? And that's problematic, right? That's systematic, but that's also problematic for us. And the second thing is really being thoughtful about how do we support teachers in general, knowing that the vast majority of our teaching core are female and are not of color, right? How do we support those folks in creating the proper spaces, right? Because what ends up happening is that when the Black teacher shows up or when the Black male teacher shows up, they're now the assigned or the ex officio dean, right? They're now they're supposed to be the lightning rod for Black and brown boys, and for my work in particular, and that's just not sustainable, right? And so there has to be some work that we're doing outside of just saying that's important, but how do we support teachers in regardless of their own personal identities in creating spaces? And then finally, how do we present ourselves and be more mindful about the fact that just because I am of color does not mean that I share the same line of difference, does not mean that I have the same understandings. Because I'm also a product of that, right? And so I'm a product of a system, I come out of it. That does not necessarily mean that all of a sudden when I become a teacher, I've been released of those systematic oppressions. And so how do we support those teachers, not assume that because of their Blackness, that they are able to grow Black and brown children? And how do we support them in not projecting negative things unbeknownst to them, right, onto children?
Yeah, awesome, that's powerful. There's a whole other history that you're talking about that we don't learn, and the education has to be beyond those four walls, or else we risk ourselves being very limited and very, as I think someone wrote in the chat, very monolithic about the actual history of ourselves and our people. Before you answer, William, I just wanted to say that I am so moved in this time frame that we're in. I actually finally took the African ancestry test in order to find out what's going on my mother's side in terms of my roots before America. And so I'm hoping to get those results back in a month or two. But for some of those many reasons you mentioned, Dr. Bethia, there's a knowledge and a need for understanding of our roots and our history before, and kind of what Jason said earlier, knowing ourselves.
Agreed, Dr. Best, and I took that. I did my African ancestry, and I did whatever the other exam is, and found out that I am from my heritage traces back to Gabon. Had I known that as a high school student, maybe I would have been more apt to learn French, right? because I would have known that that's actually a part of culture. But those are things that we need to think about. How do we set up children to understand themselves past the superficial, past there's more to Black folks than the transatlantic slave trade. Like there's a lot more to us. How do we then memorialize that, right, in a way that makes sense curriculum wise, and how do we shift that out of the elective space?
Yeah,
right?
Beautiful. Yeah, awesome. William, I'd love to hear from you on this.
As far as like just moving forward, like past this whole like COVID epidemic and this regarding the civil unrest that's happening now, one of the things that my biggest concern is, and I think about my kids, being in the house now, homeschooling and everything that they're going through, and seeing pieces of the news when we do turn on the news and asking questions that I know that they're not ready to process. It's just really focusing on the mental health of a traumatized community, right? We're talking about Black and Brown communities. We're talking about a community that's 10% more likely at risk to experience like a psychological distress already. So when you add in this whole new unprecedented pandemic, and then you add in, years and years and years and years of systematic oppression, there's a lot that needs to be in process from the self first before we can really kind of focus on other things. So that for me is really a thing to just kind of focus on. How do we enter into a space, and how do we prepare a space when we talk about Sorry about that. How do we enter into a space in this new space of education to where my mental health is something that is the focus first and foremost? Because if I can't connect with myself, then I could care less about Columbus. I could care less about any other type of history or math lesson you outside of me try to teach me. I'm not going to connect with you because I have my own things going on. And that was a thing before in education. And now I think it's going to be at a whole different level. So really preparing the school system with therapists, social workers, things of that nature to really prepare to take on the onslaught of what's to come. I'm more so, I focus on more of the preventative, right? If we don't address that situation, then I think we're just going to continue to perpetuate everything that's been going on, and we're not going to be able to get it right. And when I say mental health, right, some people think the far extreme of mental health. I'm talking about something as simple, everyday words that we use, like stress, anxiety. We talk about depression. We talk about PTSD. A lot of kids and students have had family members that have died, or are now in a place where they've lost their jobs, or are now just trying to maintain and trying to figure out what is normal. So there's a lot to unpack. And I mean, even if you want to take it a step deeper than that, take it away from the students and then look at it, look at yourself. Just take an inward look at yourself and what you're going through and how you process. I'm quite sure every day hasn't been happy-go-lucky. I'm quite sure everything hasn't fell into place the way you wanted it to. I'm quite sure your everyday life has been disturbed and you had to figure it out. And fortunate enough, fingers crossed that, everybody on this call have been in a space to where you're doing okay figuring things out. Now take that to a mindset of somebody else who might not be as mature or do not have as much access to be able to control their fate. It's a little bit more challenging. It's a little bit more puzzling. There's a little bit more of a mystery there. So from an educational standpoint, I think we have to be able to connect with the student in that realm before we push content on anybody. Even from a content standpoint, I think we have to be more intentional about the lessons. To echo Dr. Matheo's point, we have to be more intentional about the lessons and the curriculum that we're putting in front of our students, right? If a thing in the past has never really been to dig into a student's culture or history, moving forward, I think it's more important now than ever. That was a great point that you brought up, Dr. Matheo, as far as like just even knowing your history, knowing your past. I also did the DNA test, and as a grown man, as a father, as a brother, as a son, being able to identify with that information actually also brought a sense of pride. So I walk into a space with a different sense of pride because I have more of an understanding of self. right? And that's what I'm saying. All this always connects back to self, because who you are and who you show up as is how the world takes you and what you project onto the world. So we have to start there first. And I think the education system, because it is such a personal thing when we talk about education, I think we have to start there, or at least incorporate that into the everyday process of education somehow or another.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, last question for you all as panelists before I open it up to questions that we're going to collect from everyone else. If anybody else wants to ask a question, please write it in the chat. But I keep hearing the theme of like social empowerment and economic empowerment for Black and Brown communities. And I'm just curious, like, I know you all represent your organizations, and I'm not trying to get anybody into trouble, so to speak, but I'm just curious, like, it's sort of a two-part question. Number one, how does this affect the way that you spend your dollars? How does this affect the way you spend your dollars? And then number two, what sorts of, like, I feel like to a degree, because we as Black and Brown people have always had to learn to code switch and exist in dual worlds, growing up, being educated in different worlds that look very different than our homes do. And the system of elitism that education causes really tries to pit people who have that educational knowledge against those who don't, right? So there's even an elitism within the Black and Brown communities of like PhDs and lawyers versus those who live in the hood and those who may not have the access to that education. So correcting the wrongs, not only of our own community amongst each other, but also realizing that we didn't cause this injustice. It was redlining that causes. It was laws against voting that causes. It was things that white people did that caused the injustices and the imbalances that we have in our society now, to the degree that now we feel that they're also the ones responsible for finding the solution. It's not us that find a solution, it's really them. So considering that, right? Number one, how do you spend your dollars? And number two, in what ways do we call to the carpet our white brothers and sisters and allies to really move the needle, so it's no longer just like kind of what Dr. Bethia said earlier, it's no longer us appeasing our white counterparts by giving them answers and resources and books to read, like White Fragility and Anti-Racism, and then saying, so they feel better. Like, I feel better now because I have these books, I read these books, I know the language, and I post it on social media. But how do I actually now go beyond that? How do we call to the carpet the white brothers and sisters who really want to partner, who really want to see economic justice? Do we dismantle capitalism? Do we dismantle the way that banks and businesses and corporations work? Or is there another way to make change that really brings about equity with somehow keeping the same system in place, the same structures that really employ us, they give us our paychecks, they give us our abilities to kind of maneuver in throughout the world? How do we really call to the carpet those who have been responsible for setting up these levels of injustices at every aspect and every sector of our society? So if you can kind of speak a little bit briefly to both of those, and then what we'll do is after that, I'm gonna ask Jorge to start feeding me some of the questions and maybe allow you to interact with the people directly as well. So how do you spend your dollars? How do we call to the carpet those who have set up the systems of injustices that continue to perpetuate themselves today? So please, let's go with Jeff and then whoever wants to go next.
So you said something really profound in terms of like the elitism or like the different classes of the Black and Brown experience in a sense, right? But now one thing that was so profound and like 2 weeks ago was the Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper Central Park scenario. So Amy Cooper, white woman, Christian Cooper, Black man, he's a bird watcher, white woman, a dog. He told her to make sure that, she like puts the dog on a leash. She calls the cops on him, and that could have went really bad, right? But if you look at, and I sent a friend of mine the following day Christian Cooper's LinkedIn, right? And I was like, hey, like, do you know this guy? And my friend was like, oh no, like, who is he? Like, he has a really good resume. In his resume, it's Marvel, like he worked for Marvel Comics. I think he's a biochemist, and he went to Harvard University. He's a graduate of Harvard. So then I said, hey man, like, do you know him, right? And like my friend is not really too well informed with the news, so I was like, yo, do you know him? And then he was like, no. And I was like, yo man, like, this is a guy who could have been killed by the police, and he was discriminated against, and the first thing that they saw was that he was Black and not his resume, right? So in that, what's the unifying factor of all Black people on Earth, right, is the fact that in certain parts of Earth, right, the United States and certain other countries, you will be seen as Black first, right? And for those who are looking at your Blackness, they see it as a threat, right? So like, that's the unifying factor. So with the fact that we are unified by default, we need to, going to your second question in terms of how do we spend our dollars, we have to spend our dollars together, right? And we all have to see how is it that we could do so. Here's the thing about entrepreneurship, right? The difference between Black entrepreneurship and white entrepreneurship, right? And I'm generalizing things, right? So, but the fact is that lots of like Black and brown entrepreneurs, brilliant, have fantastic business models, and has a really great plan, but they don't have the capital for error, right? Which means that we have to operate out of perfection, because if we make a mistake, it'll cost more. So we operate with a pen, whereas other communities operate with a pencil, right? So as a result, it's like, wow, like my mistake cost me a lot and I can't afford that, literally, right? So how can they help? They help by being advocates on our behalf, right? So it's not looking at us as lesser than, because we're not lesser than. We just need the access, the resources, and the opportunity. So give us the opportunity, and then we'll show you what we got. We're not a lesser than people, right? We are brilliant. We're smart. We're a resilient people. I mean, for us to experience what we've experienced just in these past like 3 months, for us to experience what we experienced in 2020, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, so much so that we even like Kobe Bryant death hit us even harder than everyone else, right? Because we didn't only look at Kobe Bryant as like a basketball hero. We looked at him like, yo, like, that's me, man. That's a dad, right? That's my, right? So it's like, we looked at, so when like he passed away, it was like, yo, like Kobe moved the world, but to Black men specifically, yo, he was like, I just lost a piece of me, right? So I'm saying all of that to say that, we really need advocates, right? And we also need opportunity and capital.
Yes, I'll go. So in terms of my economic dollars, so I think part of and I agree with everything that Jeff said. I think part of our consideration is also some of the things that I was personally kind of taught when I was younger, which was essentially like, when you get this education, you get this level of finance, and then like you move out the hood because that's the goal, right? And so like changing the goal. Like I live in the South Bronx. I chose to live in the South Bronx. I chose to live here because one, when we know better, we do better, right? And so I think there's a misconception, or I think that there's a feeling, not a misconception, but there's a feeling like we can't gentrify our own neighborhoods. Like we can't bring resource into our own spaces. And maybe gentrify was the wrong word. But I think that there's an ability for us to be able to say, no, we're going to bring a level of our own resource, kind of similar to Jeff's point. We're going to take our dollars and we're going to invest those dollars in spaces and places. And so I choose to spend my money in my neighborhood. I choose to spend my money. I bought my property here. And I didn't have to live here, right? Like, I think people, especially when they hear the Bronx, they're like, oh, like that's because no, I love the Bronx. This is where I was raised, and I felt it important to live here. I felt it important to be in my community. And also, like, you asked a question about sometimes also calling us to the carpet and saying like, and thinking about the economic piece that you talked about and shifting the why. And I never forget, I was in a store once on 3rd Avenue, and one of the customers was like, yo, can I get this at a discount? And the owner looked at him and said, if you was in Macy's, you would have never said that, right? If you were, because you're in a Black-owned business or in a minority-owned business, you feel it okay and appropriate to ask me for a discount. But if you were in a white space, you would have never said that. And I think that expectation, as I talk to my friends who are entrepreneurs, they're like, everybody always trying to get a discount. Everyone's always trying to but like they don't do that in like other communities. And I think we have to say like our stuff is valued at a level that's like, it's not like we shouldn't be asking each other for discounts in that way. And I get it. I love a good discount, but I also understand like what that does to the store owner, what that does to the person online trying to sell their items. And like the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why are we doing that? Why are we saying, when I see someone that looks like me, it's okay for me to ask them for a discount? It's okay for me to get a hookup. Is that because I have an affiliation with that person, or is it because I feel like the item is at less value? Like I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an answer that we as people of color need to come to. And I think that when you look at other communities, Asian, Jewish, etc., you see different purposing in how we're spending, and we just got to get smarter around it. So yeah, I spend my dollars in my neighborhood, and I don't ask for discounts.
Love that, Dr. Bethia. I think the stat I heard on that is that on average, Jewish neighborhoods spend their dollar. The dollar circulates 6 times within their community before it leaves their community. Whereas in the Black community, Black and brown communities, it circulates maybe like 1.5 times or something really small. And so, yeah, that's really important. I love that you chose to live where you live. I live in Harlem on 135th for the same reason. I don't want to say exactly my address because those Zoom bombers might be here. But yeah, I want to stay local. I want to spend my money local. Many of you have probably even seen like a list of Black-owned businesses that have started to circulate that are available here, not only in New York City, but also nationally. And so if anybody wants those resources, feel free to hit me personally on that. And yeah, I do want to open it up before we start giving questions. We have a few questions from people. So I want to open it up before we do that. But if anybody else wants to answer that question before we move on to the audience questions.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this really quickly, only because I'm from the South Bronx. You see my Bronx native hat too, right? And I want to touch on what Bethia was saying, because I think it's important, right? And so growing up in the Bronx, before I went away to undergrad, I never hung out in the Bronx, right? Because I also believed in the same narratives that were being created by the media about the Bronx. I'm like, and also growing up in the hood, I'm like, yo, I don't want to be around this. In my mind, I was tricked into thinking the Bronx wasn't the home that I should embody, right? After college, after like trying to be intentional about studying myself and where I come from, I came back home and I'm like, nah, I need to learn more about the Bronx. And so I made an intentional decision to get involved with what was happening and learning what was going on in my community. And through that, I got involved with a young professionals committee for an arts org, right? I started to learn about the restaurants that were popping up through gentrification in the South Bronx. But what's interesting, a lot of the restaurants that are popping up in the communities that are being gentrified are owned by people of color from the Bronx. And so, including a bookstore, we got one bookstore in the Bronx, in the entire Bronx, right? It's now there. It's called the Lit Bar, owned by an Afro Latina woman who's really dope, right? Yes. And so now people are asking like, yo, come hang out over here, come do this. I'm like, nah, I'm staying in the Bronx. I got restaurants, I got clothing stores, I have all these different things that are owned by people of color that I can now support. I donated to some of these restaurants during COVID, right? And so I think that it's important. It was important for me, at least, to learn more about what was happening in the community and how I can get involved. So that's one way I've started to contribute to some of our businesses that are owned by people of color. And the other thing is, as I'm starting to try to build out my own work, I start to think about who's in my network that is maybe up and coming, has a startup that is able to provide the product that I need, right? So if it's t-shirts, I'm calling my mans. I'm like, yo, I know you make t-shirts. Can you make this for me, right? I need a website. I'm calling my homegirl. Yo, can you do this website for me? And they all are willing to do this for free. But something I might have been Dr. Bethia, you that said it, but somebody was saying something about discounts. That I think that was you. And so what I thought about is like, as my friends, these are close friends of mine who are able to provide me with what I need. I'm thinking about the time and effort that they're putting into the work and their intellectual property. So although they don't want me to pay, I say to them, no, I'm gonna give you something. Is this okay? Like I have to give you something for the time that you've taken to create this really dope product. So that's like another way I started to think about how to contribute to folks of color who are doing this work, who may not have a startup, but they're able to produce, some sort of project or product that I need. And so that's been pretty big for me as well. And also, there was another question really quickly, Sean, you asked about, it sounds like accountability, but also like allyship. And I think as we continue to build with those who want to get involved with the work, I think a big part of this is also recognizing privilege and how you can utilize that privilege to create opportunity. And even for myself, right? Understanding I'm a fair skin, understanding that I have a master's degree, that opens doors to other things I may have not been able to access had I not received those things. And so as I'm able to understand even my own privilege and that of others, I'm able to start to figure out how to create these opportunities. I'll give you a quick example. I have a podcast, quick plug-in, Live from the Bronx. And what we're doing there is similar to what we're saying and trying to create a space to highlight Bronx creatives and change makers who are doing amazing work that would never get a platform. And so, and some of which who do, but it's this wide variety where we get to really celebrate this work here and highlight these folks. And we needed a studio. And so I'm a part of this committee. I've known the co-founders of this organization for a number of years. They've known me since I was in high school. 2 white men who are involved in social justice work. And so I was hesitant to call them, but I'm like, you know what, let me call. They got a studio, they got a whole art center. I'm like, let me see if I'll pay for their space, whatever. Yo, these dudes were straight up like, yo, we've known you for X amount of years. You're doing great work. We believe in what you're trying to do. We'll not only give you the studio for free, but we'll give you the keys to the building. Right. And so I think that is super important to think about. Right. And it's like that's kind of what I think about when we talk about like allyship and privilege, is like, how do we use our privilege and encourage others to use their privilege to create access and opportunity. So I'm gonna stop there, but just some things that really came to mind as I was reflecting.
Awesome. That's so awesome. Thank you for sharing that. There's a lot of great ideas, great ways to stay local and to contribute back to your community. I think we have a couple of questions that kind of segue off of that question from the audience. And so I'm going to ask one of them. And so one was that I thought was really good was like, there are a lot of resources going out there. I saw this crazy, have you guys been watching on like IG and Facebook? Now they're able to take like somebody's face and put it on another body and make that person's mouth talk like it's a whole nother person. So like I saw they put like Steve Harvey's face on some other chick's body and like had him talking like using the words that she was saying, but with Steve Harvey's facial expressions. And so it kind of pointed out to me the elevation of artificial intelligence that now allows certain news items or now certain pieces of media to be altered and fabricated to either manipulate your senses or to even give you the impression that it's coming from a reputable source when it could be coming from a source that's not reputable at all. So like, I know that even if you've ever watched the documentary on Facebook and some of the things that they went through in their lawsuit a few years ago, when they were trying to, people were using Facebook as a means and a platform to discourage Black voters from voting for certain people, even in, I believe it was Trinidad, I want to say in Tobago in 2009, where people, there was a campaign that was made up called the Do So campaign, where basically under the guise of Black leadership, they were encouraging Black Trinidadians between 18 and 35 to not vote because they were saying they were mad at the government. And so there was enough 18 to 35-year-olds who did not vote enough where a non-Black person ended up winning the office because they actually hired a company to use Facebook as a tool to sway people away from voting for a Black president. So that being said, with artificial intelligence rising, with the ability to manipulate social media, how do you discern between the reputable sources that are out there telling you news and the fake news that's out there, the actual fake news that's really trying to detract us from a clear vision and path to go forward with an economic plan and a social plan, but maybe it's trying to like inundate us with the idea of just like being submerged in images that are constant, revisiting the past and the hurts and the things that went wrong, so that we're distracted enough to not actually have a plan going forward. How do you discern between the fake news and the good news? Which I thought was a really good question from someone in the audience.
Yeah, like if I could start with that. Yeah. So that's a really great question. And one thing that we have to really, keep in mind is, the world is changing. It's changing so rapidly, and technology is, accelerating things, and COVID even accelerated things even more because now, Silicon Valley is saying, hey, what's the future of work? How does that look like, right? What's the digital and virtual space? For which I'm saying all of that to say that when you see Black and brown people, there's even a lot of biases when it comes to the digital space as well, right? So believe this week IBM left the AI space because they were seeing how they're not able to get it right. You know what I mean? And they don't want to be associated with a technology that has a lot of biases in it, right? But now one of the reasons why that analysts are saying, et cetera, like I'm a geek when I'm always reading all these things, is that, those who are importing the data is usually white males, right? So there aren't enough data sets on us because they don't necessarily care, right? So artificial intelligence and technology isn't racist. It's a computer, but it's those who are importing the information. So if we're not in these rooms, and goes back to representation, who is now advocating on our behalf, right? So when it comes to facial recognition, artificial intelligence, and all of these things, we're so underrepresented that as the society continues to move forward, we're not in the decision-making tables, and we're not even at the table, period, right? So if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, right? So so that's what I would say to that. But to answer your question directly, we need to really own our media, right? Media is changing, and young people who are here, that are in college, CUNY. I'm a CUNY grad, right? I graduated from Kingsborough, right? And then I went off to York College, and then I got my master's at a school that's not CUNY, right? You know what I mean? But I learned
shout out Dr. Raj, shout out Dr. Quash.
Right. But you as young people, you have the ability to really shape the world the way that you want to see it, right? So when it comes to media, right now, we don't own media outlets, or we don't own media, but you can redefine that, right? You can now say, hey, you know what? This is how we should stream. This is the content that we should produce. Hey, like if I have 100,000 followers on Instagram, maybe I should now, create a subscription model where they could X, Y, and Z, right? So there's right now, it's a reshuffling of the deck, and you bright CUNY minds have the ability to shift and change things now. And I'll leave off with this: as these corporations are pledging hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, they need to fund your ideas. Because the ideas that you have in media, because I know that there's a whole bunch of media folks in here, right? You know what I mean? that really great idea that you may have in terms of how you want your story to be told, that needs to be funded and that needs to be amplified so that we could really understand our stories and build through that.
Yeah, beautiful.
I just wanted to to piggyback in real quick. Just 2 points real quick. I do think a lot of we should really pay attention to corporations, right? Like for instance, one point I want to make, like I know Bank of America donated like $1 billion towards like racial inequities and things of that nature. I think it was Nike, Disney, Nickelodeon, Ben and Jerry's, Reebok, Amazon, Nordstrom, Sephora have all donated money, threw money at us. Here, fix the problem. We're for you. We're supporting you. But I think the real tell in the end is, okay, well, who you're endorsing as president? Because you can give all this money away and say you're for the cause, but if you put leadership that's in place that won't allow you to spend or open up programs that are actually going to be supportive of the communities that you're supporting at the end of the day, then it's all for show. So by us following corporations where their money is going, by us seeing exactly what, understanding what their next moves or their intentions are, can be a way of kind of heading off whatever narrative the news or media outlets spin. For me, I know when I saw that Bank of America was going to donate that $1 billion, my eyes are glued in closely now to where it becomes closer. When it comes closer to the election, who are you going to support as your presidential candidate? Right? And then I'll know if that $1 billion is truly coming back to the community or if it might get spun and put in another direction. That to me is not, it's, a lot of times it's called, what's the old saying of pulling the wool over your eyes, so to speak, where people kind of, they stand one way in public and get the media stream to put this all over the place. And, oh yeah, Bank of America is an ally, but, we really have to pull back the cover sometimes. So to me, that's more of an accurate source of really kind of doing my own research. Like I said, I turn off the news if I'm really curious about something like COVID, right? There were all these different speculations about what can and can't with COVID and the whole nine, and people had their understanding. You've seen the memes, you've seen the news get it wrong, you've seen the government get it wrong. But for me, it was a matter of just really kind of looking at what already existed and just really comparing. I do a lot of that, the nerdy side of me is just comparing information all the time, comparing information. What's consistent, what's inconsistent, and really coming up with my own narrative at the end of the day. Not that I'm the expert, but if something's going to happen, or if it's going to affect my life or my community, then I'd rather it be based on my decision, my own intelligence, as opposed to what somebody handed to me. That's already come in with a pretty bow and packaged already. So, paying attention to the news is one thing to kind of give you, to kind of be the catalyst to maybe look into something a little bit deeper. But I don't think that we should totally rely on any source at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, you have to realize at the source of all of the news media is man or woman, and we all make errors, right? So so that's just my piece that I just wanted to put out there real quick. Something I wanted to tie in real quick regarding allies too. I don't call anybody an ally. People come to you during this time and they're like, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? First off, don't come to me and ask me that question if you haven't done your research and your history first and foremost. If you don't understand the history of what got us here, then there's no way that I can give you one answer that's going to help you get us, to give you that's going to fix everything. Right. Obviously, this is not a problem that we can fix ourselves. So an ally, is somebody who recognizes their privilege and they're willing to use their platform, their privilege to speak up in spaces where they would typically be quiet. To enter into those rooms that people aren't in, or to enter into those media spaces that people like me and you aren't in, and speak up when they know that the story is being spun wrong. Like, wait a minute. Actually, funny enough, I was watching CNN a while ago, and it was the reporter was in Atlanta and was over sensationalizing the story, and Don Lemon pulled him back like, well, wait a minute. Did the car hit somebody, or was the car already parked there? Kind of fact checking him on air. And I was so proud because a lot of times it sounded like good news, and a lot of times people will let things go. But just holding people, even within these spaces, holding each other accountable. And I think until we have that, to where we have people who have access, who are in these different spaces, holding each other accountable, then you can call yourself an ally, because now you're trying to change the narrative in the space that you operate in, that you know is not productive, and that you know is not assisting with the advancement of your own, of the community. So let's be careful. I just wanted to put that out there too. Just let's be careful who we call an ally at the end of the day. And let's make sure that the people that we are calling ally understand the history of why we're even here having this conversation first and foremost. But I just wanted to digress, and I'll just end with that.
That's great. Great response, William. I really appreciate that. And, you know, there's a great article. I'm going to try to find it while we're having this conversation. It's about performative allyship. And it's about the idea that a lot of times we don't see how deadly that can be, because a lot of times when people are caught up in just like using hashtags and having one conversation with a colleague who's Black or brown, they feel justified in saying that they've solved the problem, and they feel comfortable going back to business as usual. And we should not be in that space anymore. I'm going to pull from one more question and try to make sure that we have some time here for you all to kind of add in your own sort of best practices going forward as well, and books that you might have read or might recommend, or things you might think are good resources for our directors and our students to know. I want to read this real quick. This is a post that from the IG account Formation App, which I believe is about restoring power to African at the diaspora of African people. So it says this: the 10 richest Americans are 100% white. US Congress is 90% white. US governors are 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. President and vice president, obviously 100% white. US House Freedom Caucus, 99% white. Current US presidential cabinet, 91% white. People who decide which TV shows we see, those TV execs, 93% white. People who decide which books we read from publishing companies, 90% white. People who decide which news is covered, 85% white. People who decide which music is produced, 95% white. People who directed the top 100 grossing films of all time are 95% white. Teachers, 82% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. And finally, owners of professional football teams, 97% white. So I read that because, you know, this is what, in my mind, the epitome of white supremacy looks like. Every aspect of sector of society has been controlled by this narrative of who has access to things. And I think often about this idea of when we look at companies that are considered the most reputable companies on TV, it's always those companies that have been around the longest, right? It's like the Edward Jones or JP Morgan's, because they say we've been around since 1918, right? Or your favorite whiskey brand, we've been brewing whiskey since 18 something, right? So if it's already set up for us that the most reputable is those who have been around the longest, how do we begin to combat that narrative and to put in education and in the way our mind works with our Black and brown young people that are coming behind us, the decolonization of our minds, so that we can really find that we have the power and agency to create our own and make it reputable enough that it rivals what's going on out there, right? And so a lot of times, you know, when people are choosing which vendor, someone mentioned, but it might have been Jeff, but mentioned like, what vendor do you go with, right? Which vendor do I hire to do the flooring in my company, or to provide the food for this event for my university? A lot of times people are like, well, this group has been around forever. We know this group. How do we even begin to change that conversation so that it's like we can get people in a privileged space to start to understand the value of going with a company that is Black or brown owned, that has only been around for a little while? And so with that idea, I think about just my own personal experience growing up. My father was a pastor. My mom was a school teacher. And, you know, a lot of times when it came to like the companies we were going to use for our church for different events, you know, we would often go with the white company, you know, over the Black company, because my parents had this sort of mindset of like, well, we know they're going to do it right, you know, because they, you know, and they were saying covertly because they're white, right? And so just understanding that this ideal of ownership and this idea of just how do we even make an economic impact when we don't even see the stock market being affected, right, by the senseless killing of Black and brown people. Like the stock is the same. Big business seems like it's going about its own sort of systems, and maybe not even being slowed down by some of these issues. But how do we begin to change that narrative of like, we use Black and brown businesses, even when our own people sometimes don't even see, they are still under that same metric and that same structure and mindset of like, we go with the group that's been around the longest as opposed to the group that really serves our community the best. So I want to open that up, and then then I'll ask you to give your best practices going forward before we close this conversation.
Yeah. So Lauren says a white man's ice is cooler, right? That's what Lawrence just said in the chat. Yeah. Well, so what I would say is that, yesterday on the Gentleman's Factory's digital platform, we had a conversation about like the global economy, right? And then we had someone there who's an attorney, and he's like a really big investor, and he was talking about Africa, right? And like, what are the like investment opportunities there? And then when you put it into context, he said that like Africa has a population of 1.2 billion people, right? 1.2 billion people, right? The Caribbean, millions upon millions of people. So when you look at like society in the world, it's a global economy. But if you just look at, or if you just focus on your block or focus in brown, like I live in Flatbush. So if I'm just focusing on Flatbush, then I'll just see that, oh, wow, like this is my world, right? But if you really look at the fullness of the globe, and working from home does that, because working from home, I'm interacting with folks from East New York. But the same way that I'm interacting with folks from East New York is literally the same way that I'm going to interact with someone from London, right? So if we now start to fully understand our power and our strength, we'll now say, hey, man, let me connect with the brother from Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic, right? And we've been embedded in us the fact that we are minorities, but to be told, we're actually the majority. We got 1.2 billion people in our own continent, right? So, it's like really, shifting our minds to really fully understand our true strength and our true ability. And I'll end off with this, because I know that there's so many of you guys that have so many great things to say. And like, please send me over those stats, right? Oh my God. I mean, like, that's definitely something that I want to open up with in like a talk or something. But although these, men, white men predominantly own everything, we just saw within these 2 weeks that we just shifted the world, right? So although they may have the decision-making power, quite frankly, we have the decision-making power, right? Because we came together, we were saying, we're just so frustrated. We want to make sure that, we look at the world pre-COVID and post-COVID. So when I was in Yahoo yesterday, or Yahoo Finance, I told America, I said this, I said, we can't unlearn what we just experienced, right? And in that, yes, we are. Okay, right? And this is what working from home looks like, right? You know what I mean? I got, remote learning for her, right? Sorry. Go back to your classroom. So we need to figure out remote learning, by the way. Educators, please figure it out, right? What I was saying was, we can't unlearn what we just experienced. So over these past 2 weeks, we really moved the world. Out of nowhere, SoftBank says, hey man, $100 million, Bank of America, $1 million. And all of these policies now, everyone is trying to enact. And there's so many. Now, you would think if someone would have said at the beginning of 2020 that, oh man, like, Congress is gonna, work overtime, right? You know what I mean? And be focused. If Charles Schumer is gonna wear a dashiki, right? You know what I'm saying? So I'm saying all of that to say that in reality, we're the ones who have the power, and then we have the ability to move things.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Powerful.
I'll add. And I agree a lot with what Jeff is saying. I'm going to take it just from the perspective of how do we grow children into a level of access? And I think there is a mindset shift that's going to have to happen at a lot younger of an age, right? And where we're saying, if Black men want to be teachers, that's okay. That's a narrative, right? And so, as someone who was academically okay, right, in school, the conversation was you'll be a lawyer. That is like that was what makes sense. Or you be a nurse, or you be a doctor, or even when we talk to kids about entrepreneurship, what are we really saying, right? We're not talking about C-suite. That's not, and so I say all that to say there's a level of what are we presenting as possibility to children? What are we projecting in terms of and what we do, right? And so going back to your example about kind of who we purchase from and how we purchase from them and what we say behind closed doors around, so and so who also has the business, right? All of that is going to matter because these children are listening. They are listening loud and clear. And if we don't start to shift mindset in terms of possibility, and we present that as a disingenuous thing, like, oh, sure, you could be the president. Like, I get it. Obama did it. But if you go to the back of a history book, there's not 45 of them in the book right now. There's 44, right? And he's one of the 44. And if we want another Obama in the next 44, we're gonna have to do more than kind of just fake pump that and be like, oh, like you can do that if you try really hard, right? And that's gonna require a level of access. It's gonna require adults that are in those positions to feed into schools in a way that we just haven't in the past. And to unlock secrets in a way that we just haven't in the past. Because the bottom line is there is a I believe it to be a misconception, right? That we all share the same pie, and your success actually has the potential to hurt me, right? So I don't give you access to what I have. You don't get my secrets, right? And you don't get my secrets because if I give those away, you're gonna use those and leave me hanging. And that's a problem in itself. And unfortunately, that's a way in which I've seen a lot of people of color operate even within the same office, within the same job, the same profession, right? And that is super problematic, right? And so we have to say at one point, this is a community resource. I give this to all. I give up my intellectual property in exchange for the up and up, right? Like we all do better if we throw it into the pot. And I think if we can do those two things, if we can double down on how we as Black professionals feed into schools, feed into supporting children, it's not just the teacher's job. That kid goes home to a house, that kid goes home to a neighborhood, right? And if they don't see an accountant, if they don't see a businessman, if all they see is the drug dealer, then what am I going to aspire to be, right? And so we're going to have to rethink how we show up in kids' worlds. And we're also going to have to think about how we provide kids real access, not just the fake internship where they're doing paper, but like real access to some experiences that they may not have if we don't give it to them.
Can I add to this really quickly? Because I want to kind of put what you said, Bethia, into real time with two gentlemen who are here, right? Our host, Sean and Jeff, really quickly. So like, I met Jeff maybe like 2 years ago at a coffee shop. And the way I got in contact with Jeff was I heard about the Gentleman's Factory through a colleague when I was working at CUNY. And he was telling me, because a lot of my passion was around young men of color and trying to do this work. He said, yo, you got to check out the Gentleman's Factory. I DM'd Jeff. I didn't know much about the Gentleman's Factory. I said, I just want to learn about what you're doing. Yo, I DM'd Jeff. Didn't hesitate. He got right back to me. Didn't know me from a hole in the wall. We set up a meeting. We went to the coffee shop and we started to break bread and talk. And all I did was I wanted to learn about Jeff's journey. I was like, well, Jeff, how'd you become like who you are? How'd you get here? And we started talking, and he happened to already be a DOE vendor. I work with NYC Men Teach. He also does some great work. We're like, yo, we could not only can I learn from you personally, but we can also talk about how we can utilize your services as an initiative, right? And so that was like, I say that to say, like, asking questions and encouraging our young people to think critically, which doesn't happen, and allowing them to be vulnerable and wanting to learn and ask questions. Sean was a similar situation. Me and Sean were at the same diversity conference back in December, I think, early December, with a great mutual friend of ours, Mark. Yeah. And we're coming down on the train. I said, Sean, I hope you're okay with me sharing the story real quick. But I said, Sean, I was at the BMI conference in October, and I saw you up there, and I remember Sean stunned on all the CUNY like I ain't never seen it before. He was up with that podium and was like, look, I'm here because I love this work and I'm passionate about it, but I have a business that's doing really well. I said, for you to stand up there and share those words, one, not only told me about your leadership and your ability to do amazing work and like your belief in doing the work, but also saying like, yo, we could have multiple streams of income and I can build out while also doing what it is that I love. And so I'm on the train with Sean, and I said, Tama, I got a 3-hour ride with this brother. I'm not about to let this pass up. So I said, Sean, how'd you start your business? What'd you do? And he literally, in that time, while he was working on his business, right, doing some stuff, he was like, yo, so these are the sites you could go to, this is what you could do. I started writing it down, then I learned about the amount of money because he was telling me, he's like, this is what it costs. I said, what? I could do this? Nobody, so now I'm on my way working on some of that stuff, right? So I say this to say, we, like Dr. Bethia, I just want to emphasize on that, right? That information and that knowledge passing, because it's something like I would have never started to take any steps in that direction had I not spoken to these two dope brothers about some of that work. And now being able to see, yo, how do I produce my own product or do this, X, Y, and Z. So I just wanted to share that because it's happening in real time. And I think it's so important because we just don't have the information. We don't know.
Facts. That's awesome, Jason. Thank you, man. And I appreciate the shout out. It's funny that you said that because I also did the same thing with Jeff myself, where I was like, yo, Jeff, we got to get up. I want to just learn how you do what you do and just like hear your story a little bit. And he was just so willing to do that. And I know he's already super busy. So for him to do that, and then on top of that, Jason, I'm watching you too and watching how you are creating forums and streams to actually interact with the public that I've always been afraid to do because sometimes I get nervous about like, all right, do I have to really like talk to people? Like I grew up kind of like a quiet kid, so I'm still learning to be comfortable in this space. So I just appreciate you guys, man, for what you're doing. Jeff, you, Dr. Bethia, Jason, William. And so I do want to kind of wrap it up here, and I really appreciate you guys being so vulnerable and transparent. I think one thing that's beautiful about you all as men, as Black and Latino men, is that you all have experienced, you have shared with me a degree of vulnerability in our own personal times together and sharing our stories. And even Dr. Bethia, when you and I talked on the phone and you called, you just said, I want to check in to see what BMI is up to and just how we can partner. Like that vulnerability and transparency you have exhibited, you all have exhibited in a way that shows us that the shame of the past that Black and brown folks have experienced of saying, well, I never got a chance to do this, so therefore the story ends. Like, or you see sometimes our generation before us that says, well, I never got the college degree, I never got the access or opportunity, so therefore I kind of have lost my fire. You guys are like continuing to have the fire because you don't let anything that has been even an obstacle or a failure in your life stop you from continuing to tell the story or continuing to learn, right? So I want to kind of end this conversation on an aspect of learning and working from a place of resourcefulness and abundance as opposed to a place of lack. So when you think about abundance and you think about learning and sort of continuing to tell the story to reverse the trends of shame that have plagued our community, the trends of closed and foreboding joy. We get excited, but we don't want to get too excited because tomorrow could be a bad day. I could lose my job tomorrow. Something can go wrong. So we never fully launch in our dreams and our mission. To combat that feeling of foreboding joy and shame, what would you say the best practice or the best resource you can give, top two, whatever, resources you can give to this community here on this conversation about how to have resilience, how to have shame resilience, meaning like we continue, instead of putting a period at the end of that story or that failure, we now put a comma there and keep telling the story in a better way. How do we like have resilience? And then how do we also just create abundance in our mindset and our mentality internally before we even face the world, right? So what are your two best resources of maybe self-care practices or a book or whatever might come to mind when you think of abundance and resilience? Whoever wants to go first.
I'll start off with actually it's funny with a quote from Nelson Mandela, who kind of sums things up in a realistic way, and in a mindset that kind of prepares you to keep going as opposed to just settling. And the quote is, "After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." Right? So it's, instead of, you have one big task that you accomplish, but understand it doesn't end there. There's always more. There's always a next step. There's always going to be another struggle. There's always going to be another obstacle, trial and tribulation that you're going to have to go through. So by going in with a prepared mindset of knowing that these are the things, then when you hit that wall, you're not stopping and you're not looking at the wall saying, wow, there's a wall. You're already prepared to go above it, under it, or around it, and you keep moving. Because one thing about just resilience, you have to realize that just because you stop doesn't mean that the world does, right? So you can allow yourself to be swallowed in the world, or you can understand the world and how the world works, and you can evolve with it. And I think that has a lot to do with the mindset of just being able to kind of push forward and being able to create, understanding that there's going to be bumps and bruises, and you don't lose, you learn, at the end of the day. So having that mindset of, okay, well, I fell, now it's time to get back up. Okay, what did I learn from that lesson? How can I make this better? How can I transition? Just really having that mindset of I like to call it like a hustler's mindset. Every year I come up with a quote for myself, and I think last year my personal quote of pushing was hustle or fall. Either you continue to hustle, you continue to do what you need to do, or you're going to fall by the wayside. So just speaking from a point of resilience, I know that that's always been something that I speak to, my own family about, and then a lot of students that I work with. Just having a resilient mindset will take you where you need to go. You don't need to know anything. You just need to have a resilient mindset. You just have to understand that you're not going to stop, that you're going to keep moving forward. You're going to be told no. You're going to get doors slammed in your face. You're going to run into laws and people who don't like you, who don't want you to have access. But does that mean that you stop, or does that mean you figure out another way? Keep that mindset as the foundation of everything you do. And I think you can really accomplish anything you want, regardless of how impossible it might seem to you or other people. Just keep that mindset of keep going, keep pushing forward.
Awesome. Thank you, man.
I'll jump in just really quickly. I want to offer a definition of healing that I use. And it's one that's psychological, right? I'm always thinking about systemic trauma. I'm gonna read it, make sure I have this right. This is, I found this definition from the School of Social Work, I think at San Diego State on their site. And it talks about psychological healing. So psychological healing wounds heal only through the soothing, transformative, and liberating power of successful attachments to other human beings. So I bring that up to say, right, like it kind of embodies everything we were just talking about. And the power and healing when you have a community that can build with you and that you can lean on and learn from, and kind of go through challenges together, right? And I think it's a lot of what our work revolves around in all the different spaces that we're in, whether it's the Gentleman's Factory or NYC Men Teach or BMI, right? Or My Brother's Keeper. It's all about creating those spaces. And so I think as you have those attachments to other humans who are in this with you together, like even me just being here, I just said when we came on, I was upset at just what we just heard. And having the space to have this conversation is empowering. And I feel way better, like way better. And so I offer that as a solution. I think too, just practical resources really quickly. I think one of the first books I read when trying to like just better understand what's happening in education is Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And also I mentioned this book earlier, but Tina Love, I was trying to see where I had it around me somewhere, but We Want to Do More Than Survive. A lot of the stuff that we talk about in education today, or just like with inequities, have been written about and spoken about for years and years. And for some reason, they just never made it to us, right? So I think that, two books that I offer that we can look up in terms of resources. And the last piece, one word of advice, one of the best pieces of advice that I've learned and heard coming literally right out of college, right? It was an internship. I had a mentor who said, if you work hard and you're passionate about what you do, the money will come. And so I say that to say, it's a lot deeper than what it sounds like. But through your passion, through your hard work, people start to seek you out as a resource, and people start to really, think about how they can build with you, and organically, you can turn that into income. And so this is kind of like what I'm thinking is, this is the space I'm in, just wanting to build and create opportunity and make a little money doing what it is that I enjoy and what I'm passionate about. So I just want to leave that there, and I'm gonna be quiet.
That's great, Jason. Thank you so much. Also, just if you're able to, William and Jason and also Dr. Bethia and Jeff, if you're able to put any resources in the chat box as well, that would be great. That was a great definition, Jason, and I couldn't quite remember all of it, so I was wondering if you could.
I'll write it in.
Thank you. Perfect.
I'll just contribute real quickly. I think the interesting part about, and I appreciate you asking us for a book in particular, because what I've come to find is that a lot of the issues that we're talking about, there are books, right? People have written about these issues, and they're kind of almost hidden in plain sight. And so Powernomics is a book that I'm reading currently by Dr. Claude Anderson. If you haven't started to read that, it puts a lot of this kind of, if you're having questions about like how do we create Black wealth? How do we think about like how to use our dollars? Like, I think that's a dope book to read. The other piece of advice I would give you is kind of the word that we, when my students, every day they recite a pledge, or they recited a pledge when I was a principal, and part of that pledge talked about the importance of humble confidence, right? And we use that term strategically to really talk about like the way that we show up in spaces, particularly for men, right? Like there's a level of like conditioning that's already been projected onto us about like how we show up in spaces, who we do or don't ask for help, if or whether or not we do ask for help. And so I push people to consider like what humble confidence means to them. And to me, it's really about like how you show up in whatever space you're in, because I think that, I've unfortunately had, brothers come to me say, hey, I have a product. And the minute that like I try to help them to fix it, they're like, oh, I'm going to go on to the next idea, right? Like I don't have the confidence in my own product, and I'm not humble enough to show up and like request help. And then like the last thing, I know it was said, Jason mentioned it, but like mentorship, when I say it just can't happen without it, and people like think about like how many different types of mentors you have. Like, yes, we think about mentoring in a very traditional way sometimes. And my word of advice is like, consider like any gap in your life, there should be a mentor there. If you're like, yo, I'm trying to figure out this money thing, or I'm trying to figure out this career trajectory, I'm trying to figure out how to, like I'm a father and I'm trying to raise my kid. Like you need to have some fathers that have been through this before, right? Being thoughtful about like not just thinking mentorship as like being assigned to you, right? Because a lot of people are assigned mentors or kind of like end up under the, the wing of somebody, but we have the ability to select our own mentors. Mentoring is a two-way process. All right. And so that is like a big push. And not to mention, like, you're just never too old to have mentors. I'm gaining new mentors as I move into different spaces. And so like, that's not a kid thing. That's a human thing. That's a people thing. And particularly for men of color in the spaces, I think it's just important that you have folks that have been through and can provide you some advice and also allow you to be safe and feel safe and showing up vulnerable and saying like, I don't know, right? Because in a lot of spaces, we are expected to know, right? And so just something to consider.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Bethia. Last but certainly not least.
Oh, yeah, I would say, like, and I just put a book on there. William and I are literally on the same page. We put the same book there together, and it's called The Black Tax. And it's by Sean D. Rochester, and it's about the cost of being Black in America. So that's really a good book, and that book is really good because it helps to put a cost to everything that you're feeling, right? So it's like, what is the cost to that? What is the tax to that, right? Slavery was a 100% tax on our bodies and on our labor. So how much is that in present day, right? Jim Crow, right? How much is that on the present day, right? So it's like, for those who are really interested in business and economics, that's a really good book to consider. What I would say is one of my favorite quotes, and I forget who said it, is people operate in life based off of the level of information they've obtained, right? So as a result, you can't unlearn things, right? So knowledge could never be stolen from you because you can't strip it out of your head. So the more knowledge you have, the more informed you are, the more equipped you are to really facilitate, right? And it's important to now surround yourself with people who also are a part of that same wavelength as well, right? Because if you're the smartest person in your group, you need to change groups, right? Maybe don't leave that group, right? But because they need you, but you need to make sure that you are surrounded by people who want to see you move forward, right? And I started out in Kingsborough. But then, when I changed like my circle, at Kingsborough too, they were like, well, no, first off, I started out in City Tech, right? And then I was on academic probation at City Tech. And then I got to Kingsborough. Shout out to Kingsborough for accepting me, right? And then from Kingsborough, I went up to York College. And then I got a master's at the new school, right? But saying that to say that I was blessed enough to, surround myself with people who believed in me, so that when I was on academic probation, like, the expectation was higher. It was like, yo, like, what are you doing? Right? Like, let's study, let's study, let's study, let's do this and let's do that. Because in high school, like I played varsity basketball in high school. So I was this jock and I thought that I was going to be in the NBA. Obviously that did not happen. Right. But, so I wasn't necessarily prepared for college. But again, I surrounded myself with individuals who really wanted me to succeed and to advance and to do well, right? So it's important that you all do the same because you do not grow in isolation. You got to grow together as a community.
Love it. Thank you so much, Jeff. That's really great. And to all the panelists, great ideas, great recommendations. We're going to wrap it up because we're already a little bit past time. But I love what you said, Jeff, and I kind of want to close with this. First of all, on behalf of all 31 CUNY Black Male Initiative projects, you see a lot of directors are here represented that many of you probably already know. Dr. Rodriguez from Kingsborough has been mentioned a lot, and Dr. Quash from Queens, and Maria Vidal from John Jay, and we're just, a lot of us are here in the house. We thank you for taking the time because this has been one of the most enriching conversations we've had in the past like 4 months since being quarantined, and it really has just made us feel our hearts are warm. I'm getting a lot of text messages coming through as from people who are watching on YouTube and watching on different platforms. So thank you so much for being available. But Jeff, you said this one thing that was like, yeah, please, you might want to get a new group because of the influence.
Yeah.
Maybe don't leave that old group.
Yep.
Right. And I love that you said that because we have this cancel culture now where we say, okay, you said one wrong thing. Now we're going to like excommunicate ourselves from you forever.
Yeah.
And what's the impact or byproduct of that if we just start canceling everybody? What's going to happen if we start canceling everybody and we don't ever have a chance to come back to the table with those who are truly willing to learn and advance their own education to now say, how can we include new ideas at our table, right? So we have to get our new groups, but try not to leave the old ones if you can. And some of those group texts, just put them on silent so you don't maybe hear them ding all the time, but try not to leave those old groups and realize there might be an opportunity in the future to offer your voice to move the needle in that way.
Absolutely.
So thanks for saying that. So gentlemen, I'm sure we'll be in touch in other ways. Dr. Bethia, you have put together an amazing resource of different organizations like ours in New York City that are now meeting on a regular basis to figure out how we, from an educational standpoint and economic standpoint, move the needle for Black and brown boys in education for the fall. So thank you for letting me be a part of that committee, and looking forward to helping enhancing that. And look for more CUNY BMI town halls coming forward for near you soon. And we'll continue to invite guests from around the city who are doing important work that affect the target demographic of our populations. Also want to dig in later, and Jason, you and I may have to have a conversation about this for the next one, potentially, but for also how do we like decolonize the Latino involvement in this movement, given that there's a lot of, strife and contextual history of beef between darker skin and lighter skin Latinos and even within the same country, right? And so in certain neighborhoods in New York City. So we're going to dive into that and a lot more in the future. But thank you. we're copying and pasting everything from the chat. We'll put it in our recap of our meeting. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube or whatever platform, we appreciate you being here. And until next time, this is Dr. Sean Best signing off, University Director for CUNY BMI, and we'll see you next time. Gentlemen, take care, have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Sean.
Our pleasure, man. Thank you, bro.
All right, thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Our
Thank you.
pleasure, man. All right, make sure I got all the copy and paste.
Appreciate you, brother. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir. I hear you, Larry. Thank you. Ashton, you still here?
I'm still here, brother.
Thank you for that email, man.
Yeah, no doubt, man. No doubt. Like, you know, can't stop the movement. You know what I mean? They can't stop the movement.
Yes, sir. You know, it's interesting too, because that's the first time we've been a Zoom bomb, but I was actually talking about this. I was like, yo, this has been happening. So it's really important for us I'm glad that you know what to do, because I honestly, I've seen chats where people can control it, but I've never really investigated it because I just never anticipated that would happen, you know, in a community like this. So
Yeah, man.
appreciate it. All right, boss. Have a good day. We'll be in touch.
Right.
I'm just making sure. Jorge, are you still here?
Yeah,